Mr. Salmond, when this country was under threat of extinction from the Soviets' nuclear arsenal, you opposed NATO membership. Now there's no Soviet threat, you want to join it. How does that work?
Well, just a slight correction, Andrew. Of course, I've been in the SNP when we've been pro-NATO in the 1970s. I was in the SNP when we moved policy to be anti-NATO in the 1980s. And I was still in the SNP 10 years ago, although not leader, when we changed the policy to be in favour of Partnership for Peace, which of course is a NATO-arranged organisation. So that policy has gone into transition over the years, Andrew, but the one consistent thread in our policy over all these years is our opposition to nuclear weapons in Scotland, and in particular to the Trident missile system. So that is the consistent area and the mainspring of SNP policy.
So you want to be part of an alliance which is nuclear-based, but you don't want to have nuclear weapons. How does that work?
Well, I suppose that's the same as 26 out of the 29 member countries of NATO at the present moment, Andrew. I'd rather be one of the 26 without possessing nuclear weapons than one of the 3 who are nuclear powers.
But you're happy to live under a nuclear shield of defence?
Well, to be fair to NATO, of course, in its strategic documents, it points the way to its wish to see a nuclear-free world. But, you know, I can't wish away American nuclear weapons, Andrew. I can't do that. But what I can do is 2 things. I can get Trident out of Scotland with independence. And secondly, we can agree with our friends and neighbours like Denmark and Norway that Scotland's strategic position makes it in their interests and our interests to be part of a mutual defence organisation on a non-nuclear basis.
But you used to denigrate NATO. You always prefaced it with the adjective nuclear-based. I've got lots of quotes here when you talk about the nuclear-based NATO. You wanted to stand alongside Austria, Finland, Sweden. You said it was an insult to these countries to think that Scotland couldn't stand alongside them. Now you want to join NATO, and it's still nuclear-based.
Well, it would be an insult to say you couldn't have the Partnership for Peace programme that is supported by Sweden and Austria, and now Ireland, of course, which I had to correct you recently, if I remember right, that Ireland is not any longer a neutral country. But, of course, Partnership for Peace is also a NATO-arranged or aligned organisation. So we have to look at the practicality of where we are now, and that practical argument would be that we can see a route to the removal of nuclear weapons from Scotland without disrupting the defence coordination of our friends and allies in the Nordic countries. And listen, finally, Andrew, isn't it refreshing to see such a debate come to an annual conference of a political party, just like old times, eh?
You may say that, I couldn't possibly comment. It still seems a little bit strange that you want the protection of NATO's nuclear shield, but you're going to kick a key part of that shield out of Scotland.
Well, I don't think that's strange at all, incidentally, because I think the contribution that we in Scotland can make to nuclear disarmament is the removal of Trident missile system from Scotland and the prevention of a renewal of that Trident missile system. I mean, the UK at the present moment is spending £2.5 billion a year on maintaining Trident and renewing the next system. That's, you know, roughly £250 million as a Scottish contribution. I think that's a phenomenal waste of money in the world that it is, with the economy it is, and I can think of many, many things that could put better use to these funds than wasting them on unwanted nuclear weapons.
Yes, but you are joining a nuclear-based alliance, which you have long opposed. You're either opposed to it or you're all over the shop on it. That you're for it, you're against it, you're against it, you're for it. But you've had a long record of being against it. Now you're for it. People will see it's just the latest in a long line of cynical policy changes to make you more palatable to mainstream Scottish opinion.
Well, I think the consistent thread of Scottish opinion, SNP opinion and my opinion, has been our opposition to Trident missiles and nuclear weapons in Scotland. Incidentally, you know, when the Labour Party had a position as it did in the 1980s of being against nuclear weapons, they were still in favour of NATO. I can't remember that particular argument. Despite many arguments being thrown at them, that particular argument I don't think was. So a consistent frame of opposition to nuclear weapons in this country is a consistent policy. But we've got to deal with the reality that we've got friends and neighbours who would like to see us coordinate our defence as part of the NATO framework, and the reality that 26 out of the 29 member countries do not possess nuclear weapons. Why shouldn't Scotland be one of these 26?
Of course, when Labour had your policy, it lost by a landslide, which brings me back to the point that... which brings me back to the point of how you've changed your policies.
I'll just... Well, I know you're trying to prevent me say this because it leads to the obvious conclusion.
You say whatever you want.
In both elections, thank you, Andrew, in both elections when Labour had that policy, that's 1983 and 1987, of course, they won convincing victories in Scotland. You know, that was the days when Labour were still the dominant party in Scotland.
And do you want me to say if they ran a donkey in a constituency in these days, what would have happened? But let's not go there. Let's look at your party's policies, not just on. Let's look at your party's policies, not just on NATO. I remember the days I used to go to your conferences when the SNP was an overwhelmingly Republican party. Now you cosy up to the Queen. You used to want a Scottish currency, then you wanted a euro currency. Now you want the pound. You want independence for your country, but your interest rates would be set by the Bank of England. That's your policy. And you've even admitted to me when we met in Aberdeen on camera that you'd even need a fiscal pact with London. What's the point?
All right, well, let's take the two policies. Firstly, your memory's playing tricks on you about the monarchy. The SNP has been in favour of the monarchy since 1934, Andrew. I think that in any political party terms, that seems a long range, some entire SNP history.
Your policy used to be to have a referendum on a republic, Mr. Salmond.
Having a referendum is different from the policy, which has always been to retain firstly the King and now the Queen as head of state of an independent Scotland. When you have a referendum, no, it's a secondary matter. The matter is what you argued was that we had a different policy, and I'm saying we have a long history of having a pro-monarchy policy, which we certainly embrace with great enthusiasm. And I think that's as right as it should be, because as you'll remember, as I do, it was James VI who became King of England.
No, I know all that. I was there at the time.
I know you were there at the time, and asking difficult questions of the politicians of the day. But Scotland and England had 100 years of having the same monarch and being independent countries. As far as the currency is concerned, then, you know, as the facts change, obviously policies change. We think that sterling is the best option because we've got an optimal currency area between Scotland and England. And as far as the fiscal arrangement's concerned, well, as far as our fiscal arrangement's concerned, then obviously, as you know, we contribute now 9.6% of the taxation. We get back 9.3% of the expenditure. That means we've got a 2.7 gap in terms of the relative surplus that Scotland has. Therefore, we could invest more, we could save, we could spend more, we could borrow less, which would seem to be a good idea, or any combination of these three.
All right, but
so that gives us a good room for manoeuvre in the context of an independent Scotland.
You've certainly, Mr. Sam, got plenty of room for manoeuvre. I mean, you seem to be permanently on manoeuvres when it comes to policy. I remember when you used to talk about, you used to complain.
Shouldn't talk about manoeuvres during a defence debate.
You used to complain. I've got one quote. You said it in Catalonia when you were playing to the crowd. It was horrible to be shackled to sterling. You used to wax lyrical about Scotland in Europe and having the euro currency. Now your policy is to tie your monetary policy, your interest rates and your fiscal policy to the most Eurosceptic country in the European Union. It sounds bizarre.
Well, I think that in terms of the support for the euro, that's a charge that could be levelled at the Conservative Party, the Labour Party,
I'm talking to you,
and certainly
Mr.
the Liberal
Salmond.
Democrats, even at the last election. But there's nothing unusual about that. What has happened is the facts have changed substantially, and as John Maynard Keynes once said, when the facts change, you change your mind. You do what's right for the day, and what's right for the day now is to support the optimal currency area. The point about fiscal freedom is that it gives us power over taxation and spending. And as I pointed out to you, that 2.7 billion, Andrew, is £500 per head for every man, woman and child in Scotland. That seems to me a substantial amount of fiscal freedom.
Mr. Salmond, when I've got you face to face, I'll have a go at you in the 2.7 billion, but I'm not going to do that this morning. I'm just wondering that now that you've...
We'll have a replay on it.
Yeah, we can. Now, and I hope we will. Now you're cozying up to the Queen, you're her new best friend. Now you've ditched your opposition to NATO, you've ditched your support for the euro, you're going to have interest rates set by London, you're going to have monetary policy controlled by London. What other policies will you ditch and principles before the referendum in 2014?
Well, that sounds like a question you prepared earlier. I've just pointed out the support for the monarchy.
I prepared them all earlier.
I've
been up since 6 o'clock.
Well, I wonder, but really, you should do me the honour of listening to the answers, Andrew. So I've just taken away that aspect for you. The consistent thread of SNP policy in defence has been our opposition to nuclear weapons. I think we're the only party which has been opposed throughout the lifetime of nuclear weapons to their presence in Scotland. That seems pretty consistent. And the other consistent thread of the Scottish Party economic policy is we'll do what's in the best interests of the Scottish people, socially and economically. And now that's overwhelmingly the interests of the people for Scotland to become an independent country.
Mr. Salmond, why do most of the polls show that support for independence has fallen sharply this year? Is that your fault?
Well, let's see what the next 2 years brings us. I'm the last politician in the world you should challenge to opinion polls, Andrew.
Well, I mean, support for independence has fallen 9 points in 9 months.
Yeah, last year I was told that we were heading for electoral defeat, and I should remember the result was a convincing victory for the SNP government last May. I reckon we've got 2 years in terms of engaging this argument. Something vital has happened this week. For the first time this week in Scottish history, we've agreed on a process, an agreement on a process, and also deciding by both governments to abide by the result and respect the result in the interest of the people of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. That's a fundamental step forward and sets a framework for a great debate in Scotland over the next 2 years. And I think you'd be a very unwise journalist to write off the chances of Scotland deciding on independence. As your vox pops and Stirling indicated, Andrew, it's all to play for.
Mr. Salmond, I'm not writing off anything. I'm simply asking you why, since you launched your campaign for independence, support for the Union has risen. If you lose the referendum in 2014, will that be the end of your political career? Will you head off to the great column deux églises, or whatever that is in Scotland, the equivalent of Mr. de Gaulle? Will you?
Well, listen, Andrew, I think we could write off the House of Lords. I think my boat's may be burnt in that direction. But
that's what John Prescott said.
All sorts of hypothetical. I'll listen, but I'm no John Prescott. I'll listen to all sorts of hypothetical questions, Andrew. But I like to hypothesise on success rather than failure. Okay. That's been a characteristic from my political career. It's worked all right so far, and therefore I believe we'll win the referendum in 2 years' time.
I thought that was the answer you were going to give.
For a while yet, Andrew.
You can't blame me for trying. I thought that was the answer you were going to give. One of our viewers wants me to ask you this question, which is, what first attracted you to the multi-billionaires Rupert Murdoch and Donald Trump?
Well, I could ask about the first of these. I could ask you that same question. I mean, I do what I believe to be in the best interest of the Scottish people. Well, I said in the first part of the question.
And Mr. Murdoch hasn't spoken to me for 20 years. He speaks to you all the time.
You can explain that for yourself, but I think we accounted for these things at the Leveson inquiry, and I think we came out reasonably well. In terms of the Trump development, I supported the idea of a golf course in the northeast of Scotland. I think that was a grand idea. I still think it's a grand idea. I just happen not to think that Mr. Trump should be trying to run Scottish energy policy. Seems quite simple to me.
No, I understand that on Mr. Trump. You're not best friends anymore. But since you give tea and biscuits to Mr. Murdoch in Bute House, which is Edinburgh's Downing Street, you've never given me tea and biscuits. What's the problem?
I think it was Tunnock's caramel wafers, if I remember.
Even better. Even better.
And here now, I'm willing to make you the Tunnock's pledge. Come to Bute House at my invitation, Andrew. We'll have that discussion, that replay of the 2.7 billion relative surplus.
Oh, we're going to do that.
But per head for every man, woman and child in Scotland, and I shall present you with tea and Tunnock's.
Good. Can I just point out, the last time we met, you promised you would invite me to the premiere of Brave, that wonderful Pixar movie, and I'm still waiting for the invite. Another broken promise.
I'm sure that Disney Pixar emailed you the invite but got your old News International email number.
A good answer, but not a great one. Mr. Salmond, thank you for joining us in the fair city of Perth. It'll be interesting to watch your debate this afternoon. Come back and see us soon, or I may come up and see you.
Speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.